5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and we have liftoff of NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter as we continue to explore the mysteries of the
On
red
December
planet.
11, 1998, NASA launched the Mars Climate Orbiter. This $327 million space probe took 9 months to travel almost 1 billion miles to start a 5-year mission to survey the climate on the planet Mars. On September 8, 1999, scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory sent the critical commands to the probe to engage the thrusters, which would push it into a stable orbit. The software carefully calculated the impulse being produced to determine how long to fire them. But as the probe swung around Mars, the orbit was found to be much too low. A week later, a correction maneuver was attempted, but this correction maneuver brought the probe even lower. Finally, on September 23, 1999, NASA lost radio contact as the probe burned up in the Martian atmosphere. So what had gone wrong? The software being used by Lockheed Martin, who built the probe, exported the impulse in pounds of force per second, while the JPL's computers were expecting the measurements in the metric standards of newtons per second. This mismatch of units is what caused the probe's ultimate destruction. While your website might not have millions of dollars depending upon your coding, if you aren't careful in how you use your CSS measurement units, your results might still end up off course. There are 15 CSS measurement units divided into two categories, absolute and relative. We're going to start with the absolute units and then move on into the relative units. Let's start with a basic unit, the inch. I'm going to set the CSS style on this so that the heading 1 comes out to be exactly 1 inch, heading 2 comes out to a half an inch. When you run that, it's exactly what you would expect. The size of heading 1 is 1 inch. The size of heading 2 is absolutely 1/2 of an inch. If I set the units to the metric sizes of centimeters or millimeters, I get very similar results. I have complete control over H1 being 1.5 centimeters or 15 millimeters and H2 being 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter. Another absolute measurement you are probably already familiar with is the point. When your teacher tells you to turn in your assignment in a 12-point font, you set your word processor to 12 points. In this case, I'm setting heading 1 to 80 points, and when I run that, I get an 80-point font. One measurement you might not be as familiar with is a pica. A pica is a typesetting term where 1 pica is equal to 12 points. So a 12-point font is 1 pica. In this case, the 4 picas is equal to a 48-point font. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the pixel. We can set our fonts or other items on our web page to exactly how many pixels high or wide we want them to be by just designating it in the style sheet. So in this case, H1 is 50 pixels, H2 is 30 pixels. I'm going to try changing that paragraph font down to 5 pixels just so we can see how that looks, and it's very hard to read. But that, again, should be something you're already very familiar with. So you might be thinking, great, absolute units is the way to go. That way I can have complete control over how my website is going to look. The problem is you do not have complete control over what the user is going to be doing with your website. They might have scaled the view up or down so they can see more or less of the screen at one time. They may have a very old monitor that only has 600 pixels across, or a brand new monitor that has 3,000 pixels across the screen. If you create a screen element that's 300 pixels across, you have no way of really knowing whether that's half the screen or a tenth of the screen. So you might be better off using one of the relative units. For these units, the size of the element that you create is defined relative to something else on the screen. It might be defined relative to the screen size or another font. So you can have better control of how objects on the screen look in relationship to each other, as opposed to just an absolute size measurement. The first relative unit we're going to look at is the M, spelled EM. The name has to do with the letter M, but it is defined as the height of the active font. So if you wanted a line height to be 3 times what the height of the font is, you could set your line height to 3M, and that's going to give you triple spacing. But you might be using different size fonts throughout your page. If you want to have the relative size of something be equal to what the root font is, your base font of your page, then you can use the rem command. So in this case, I've set the font to 2rem, which is 2 times the body font, which is 16 pixels. And it's not just text that you can use M and rem for. In this case, I've just set the border equal to 1 rem, and now I'm going to change it to 1/2 a rem. So that way my border size will always be proportional to whatever font size I'm using. If my font size goes down, my border size will go down as well. 2 other font-related units are the EX and the CH. The X has to do with the height of the character, where CH has to do with the width of the number 0. I haven't seen a case yet where I would want to use either of those units as opposed to an M or a rem, but they are there if you ever find yourself needing them. How's that for a ringing endorsement? Okay, the next ones we're going to look at have to do with the size of the viewport, or the screen that your user is looking at. The first one is a viewport width, and the number in front of it is a percentage. So 20 VW is 20% of the screen. 50 VW would be 50% of the screen. You can see that this M is taking up 50% of the screen. And if I adjust my width of my browser display, the font size changes to match, so it's always 50%. If I change it to 100%, it's holding at 100% of the screen. And if I take it to 125, it's actually going to go off the screen. So you can see how the viewport width will give you very good control of the size of your elements, whether it's text or boxes or whatever, compared to what the size is of the screen at the time. The VH unit, or viewport height, is very similar to that. As I move the width back and forth, it's not changing the size of my character. But if I change my screen to a smaller height, then my font size or my element size changes relative to the height of the viewport. The vmin works very much the same way as the VW and VH, with the difference of it chooses whether to change its size based on the height or width, based on whichever one of those elements is smaller. If the width is smaller, then the proportional size of the font or the element scales with the width. If the height is smaller than the width, in that case, then the unit size changes with the height of the screen. The Vmax works similarly, except for instead of looking at the minimum height, it looks at whichever one is bigger. If the width is bigger than the height, then the width is controlling the size of the element. If the height is bigger than the width, then the height is controlling the size of the element. Again, it gives you very good control over how your elements are sized on the screen compared to what viewport size the user has available to them. I'm clearly having way too much fun scrolling back and forth and watching the size change, which will bring us to our final element, the percent. Percent of what, you might ask? Well, percent of whatever you're working with. In this div element, the font size is set for 150%. Changing the size of the screen isn't changing the size of it. It must be 150% of the font size that's listed in the body. So if I change my body font size, you're going to see the font size in the div element change to match, to still be 150% of whatever it was in the body. I can also have other things set as a percentage. For example, if I set the width of this text box equal to 50%, it's going to be equal to 50% of my screen. So in this case, when I change my viewport size, you're seeing that the width of the div element is staying at 50% of the computer screen. So those are the 15 CSS measurement units. I hope as you practice using those that you'll find that you're able to make your screens look exactly the way you want them to look.